A little boy named Johnson Samuel was generally well behaved, but, like all children, had his moments of mischief. One day at school, Johnson was caught cheating during a test. The class teacher, Mrs. Stella, a kind yet firm woman, decided to teach him a lesson by giving him a few strokes of the cane, a punishment intended to correct rather than harm him. Johnson returned home that day with tears in his eyes and red strips on his palms. His mother, Mrs. Samuel, noticed immediately. "What happened, Johnson?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. "Mom, Mrs. Stella hit me for no reason," Johnson lied, sniffling to add to the effect. "I didn't do anything wrong." "What did she use on you?" Mrs. Samuel voiced. "Bamboo stick. Just look at my body, mummy." Johnson pulled off his shirt and pointed at his self-inflicted injuries as to spicy up his claims. Mrs. Samuel staring at her son's body with bruises everywhere, her face hardened with anger. "How dare she lay a hand on my child without my permission?" she fumed. "I'll teach her a lesson she won't forget." The next morning, filled with righteous indignation, Mrs. Samuel stormed into the school, dragging Johnson along with her. She demanded to see Mrs. Stella. The principal escorted her to the classroom. "Mrs. Stella, explain why you thought it was appropriate to hit my child." Mrs. Samuel shouted. Mrs. Stella, taken aback, replied calmly, "Mrs. Samuel, your son was caught cheating. I disciplined him according to school policy. I assure you, it was nothing excessive." "Nothing excessive?" "Look at his body, to the extent of using bamboo stick on him." Mrs. Samuel retorted, pointing to Johnson's back. "You had no right to touch him. I can't be paying over $500,000 for school fees, and my son returns with bruises." "But Ma, I didn't," Mrs. Stella stammered as she said in defense. "Shut up your useless mouth. It is because you are not married, and don't have a child talk more of a son, but you see this, you must pay for all this." She shunned her ranting on top of her voice. As the argument escalated, Mrs. Samuel pulled out her phone and called the police. Within minutes, officers arrived at the school. "Officers, here she is. Please arrest her," Mrs. Samuel said, pointing at Mrs. Stella. "Ma'am, we have a report of an assault on a minor," one officer said. "Absolutely." "She has to pay," Mrs. Samuel said, her voice dripping with venom. The police officer turned to Mrs. Stella. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for assaulting a child." "What? This is absurd." Mrs. Stella protested. "I was just enforcing school discipline." "Tell it to the judge," the officer replied, as he handcuffed her and led her away. Despite all efforts to plead with Mrs. Samuel by the principal and other teachers, she bluntly declined, instead pleaded with the police to take her out. As Mrs. Stella sat in the police station, she pleaded with the officers. "Please, I need to be released. I have a heart condition. I can't stay here, moreover I'm innocent." One of the officers, who had been bribed by Mrs. Samuel, shook his head. "Sorry, ma'am. You're going to have to stay here for a while, orders from above." Police refused to grant her bail even with medical reports shown by Mrs. Stella's brother. Instead they objected and tagged the evidence false and fallacious. "Your sister will remain in our custody till our investigation are over," one of the officers on duty said. "But she's innocent and in a very bad health condition. I want her released now," Mrs. Stella's brother protested. "That's none of our business, and moreover we don't take orders from you and as such not answerable to you," the other officer fired back. All efforts to bail Mrs. Stella's proved abortive. Days turned into a week as Mrs. Stella languished in jail. The stress of the wrongful imprisonment, combined with the lack of proper medical care, took a toll on her fragile health. She collapsed in her cell and was taken to the hospital, where she died after a severe battle with the doctors to save her life. Meanwhile, at home, Johnson's guilt gnawed at him. He couldn't keep the secret any longer. "Mom," Johnson said, his voice trembling. "I need to tell you something." "What is it, Johnson?" Mrs. Samuel asked, her face softening. "I lied. Mrs. Stella punished me because I cheated on a test. She didn't hit me with any bamboo stick," Johnson admitted, tears streaming down his face. Mrs. Samuel was horrified. Realizing the gravity of her actions, she rushed to the police station to rectify her mistake. But it was too late. Mrs. Stella had already passed away. The news of Mrs. Stella's death shattered Mrs. Samuel. She was racked with guilt and grief, knowing her actions, fueled by a lie, had caused an innocent woman to lose her life. Johnson, too young to fully comprehend the extent of his actions, nonetheless understood that his lie had led to something terrible. He vowed never to lie again, but the weight of the incident stayed with him, a painful reminder of the consequences of dishonesty. Now the question remained. Who actually killed Mrs. Stella? Was it Mrs. Samuel, whose anger and bribery led to her imprisonment? Was it Johnson, whose lie started the chain of events? Or was it the police, who accepted the bribe and neglected her medical condition? Thank you for watching this story. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and write down your thoughts in the comment section. Bye for now.